67 million years ago, in what is known as the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, was home to some of the last of the non-avian dinosaurs. Things like Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Ankylosaurus, and the big shot himself, Tyrannosaurus rex. For the longest time, we believed that T-Rex was the only large apex predator of its time, and that there were no other large carnivores to compete with, except for another T-Rex. That is until now. A new study has shown that T-Rex may not have been the only apex predator, and that within his kingdom was a small mid-sized predator goes by the name of Nanotyrannus. You remember that one dinosaur that paleontologists have been in a tug of war for decades? Is it a valid species, or is it just a young T-Rex? Well, a new study has shown that could prove once and for all the true identity, and that Nanotyrannus may have been real. So first we need to understand the history of Nanotyrannus. In 1942, paleontologist Dr. David Dunkel of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History found a well-preserved skull in Montana. And then in 1946, paleontologist Charles Gilmore identified the skull as a new species of Gorgosaurus. But then in 1988, paleontologists Bob Barker, Phil Curry, and Michael Williams re-examined the skull and realized, no, the skull looks different from those of Gorgosaurus, and this looks like something new, which they renamed it Nanotyrannus lancensis, which translates to pygmy or little tyrant. And so here, we now realize that T-Rex was not the only apex predator of its time, but there was another smaller predator coexisting alongside it. But this is where the tug of war begins. On one side, you have a group of paleontologists saying, we have a smaller tyrannosaur living alongside a much larger tyrannosaur in the Hell Creek Formation. On the other side, you have a group of paleontologists saying, no, this so-called smaller tyrannosaur is in fact a juvenile of an already known tyrannosaur member called Tyrannosaurus rex. In other words, this is just a young T-Rex. So which is it? So let's look at their skulls. And yes, they look very different. But you can also make the argument that just because they look different, that doesn't mean they're different animals, which is true. Yes, Nanotyrannus' skull is pretty narrow and the eye opening is quite large, and so it has the look of a young animal. Then comes in a new specimen called Jane. Jane was first discovered back in 2001, and like the type skull, she was also put on the debate table. Is she a Nanotyrannus, or is she just a young T-Rex? So not only do we have a well-preserved skull of Jane, but about 50% of her body was found. So now we have all this new data for paleontologists to argue about. So let's look at some of the differences, starting with the teeth. So Jane has about 17 tooth positions on each side of the lower jaw. In the upper jaw, she has about 15. And there's also 15 tooth positions within the type skull as well. While T-Rex has about 13 tooth positions on each side of the lower jaw and about 12 maximum in the upper jaw. And so in order for Nanotyrannus to grow into a T-Rex, you would have to lose tooth positions, which is highly impossible. No creature has to lose the number of tooth positions as they mature. And also, their tooth functions are different. Nanotyrannus has thin, narrow teeth that are very much like the blade of a knife. These are more designed for slicing through, stripping through flesh. But now look at the tooth of Tyrannosaurus rex, which is basically a railroad spike in the shape of a banana. These were more powerful teeth. These could not only slice through flesh, but punch through bone. These are bone-crushing teeth. These are more devastating teeth. So Nanotyrannus would strip flesh from bones. T-Rex would eat the whole carcass, including the bones. If Nanotyrannus tried to bite through bone, then its teeth would break, and I'm pretty sure it would hurt. Also, CAT scans of their brains show that they're quite different. And your brain doesn't really change shape as you get older, no. You can't really change the position of the blood vessels or nerves attached. So clearly these seem like two distinct animals. So the whole Nanotyrannus debate has been raging for decades, and it seems like it's hard to determine whether if this really is a juvenile or a different animal. Still, most paleontologists that say that Nanotyrannus is a juvenile are not quite convinced, even though there's pretty good evidence to suggest that it may in fact represent a different animal. But came in the third specimen. Enter the dueling dinosaurs. Not to be confused with the fighting dinosaurs, which consisted of Velociraptor and a Protoceratops. No, that's something totally different. The dueling dinosaur fossil was discovered back in 2006, but unfortunately was locked away for quite some time due to legal dispute issues. Fortunately, it was acquired in 2020 by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science, and they were able to study it. The dueling dinosaur fossil contains a Triceratops and what seems to be a teenage T-Rex or possibly a Nanotyrannus. And the skull does bear some resemblance to the type skull. So, could this be Nanotyrannus or is this just a young T-Rex? Well, from looking at the arm of this Tyrannosaur, there is something kind of off for this to be a juvenile. So if you take the arm of the largest T-Rex, known as Sue, put it next to the dueling dinosaur fossil arm, and while they're the same length, the hand and the claws are much bigger than those of a T-Rex. But the real conclusive way to figure out if this animal is an adult or if it's still growing is to look at the bone histology. In other words, they have to cut open its leg bone, put it under a microscope, and count the growth rings, which is the same way as counting the growth rings on a tree. And so from the bottom, the growth rings are spaced out. But as we move up, the growth rings get thinner and thinner, meaning that this animal was close to reaching its growth limit. So what does this mean? This animal is no juvenile. This is a full-grown adult. This animal is not a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. Nanotyrannus lancensis is real. T-Rex was not the only apex predator, but there was also a smaller, mid-sized predator lurking within his kingdom, which actually paints a much more accurate ecosystem. In most established ecosystems, there's not just one apex predator, but there's multiple. In Africa, you have lions, leopards, cheetahs, hyenas, crocodiles. In Western North America, you have your grizzly bears or brown bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, mountain lions. Any type of ecosystem, there's a variety of different predators. Each of them has their own role to play within that established ecosystem. This new discovery also tells us to rethink our understanding of how T-Rex grew. Now, we do have growth stages of other tyrannosaurs, and here's a good example. This is Tarbosaurus, the Asian cousin of T-Rex and the closest relative to T-Rex. And since we have a good understanding of how Tarbosaurus might have grown, we can also use our understanding of Tarbosaurus and apply that to how T-Rex might have grown. This new discovery also tells us that we should consider the possibility that if we do the proper studies with them, I think we're going to find that there are many dinosaur species that were once considered invalid may in fact be valid again. I mean, we brought back Brontosaurus, Stenonychosaurus, and finally, Nanotyrannus. So hopefully in the future, we can settle once and for all, are Dracorex and Stygimoloch just young stages of Pachycephalosaurus, or are they really two distinct species? Oh, what about Jane, you ask? So while Jane has some similar bones to the deathmatch fossil, her skull, however, is slightly different than that of the deathmatch fossil and also the type skull. She still has the same amount of tooth positions, yes, but her skull is slightly different. And so researchers concluded that Jane may in fact represent a second species of Nanotyrannus, that being Nanotyrannus lethaeus. And so there may in fact be two species of Nanotyrannus. Much like how in the Hell Creek Formation, there are two species of Triceratops, Horridus and Prosis. Horridus specimens are found more towards the bottom of the formation, whereas the Prosis specimens are found more closer to the top, closer to the KPG boundary, and that Prosis was the last one to go extinct. For Nanotyrannus, most of the Lancensis specimens are found towards the bottom, whereas Jane was found more closer to the top, close to the KPG boundary. So much like Triceratops, where Horridus would have evolved into Porosus, same thing can be said with Nanotyrannus, and that Lencensis would have eventually evolved into Lithaeus. This also tells us that we used to think that dinosaurs were in decline before their extinction, but it turns out that's no longer the case. New research has shown us that dinosaurs, even during the last 2 million years, they were still diversifying. Dinosaurs were still doing pretty well. Same thing can be said with plants. Plants were also diversifying, even towards the end of the Cretaceous period, as well as some of the creatures living in the shadows. Fish, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and small mammals and birds were all continuing to diversify. It was only until about 66 million years ago, an asteroid the size of Mount Everest crashed into the Gulf of Mexico, causing a mass extinction. And while the avian dinosaurs, the birds, survived today, the non-avian dinosaurs did not.